Mordred, the Knight of Treachery, son of King Arthur, and troublemaker extraordinaire. But what about the Mordred of Fate Grand Order? How well does she compare to her mythological counterpart? And what grade would I give her depiction? Let's do this. Mordred is a saber class servant, which is a solid pick for her despite Mordred's more volatile nature. Mordred as she is depicted in the Fate franchise has always been something of a blend between a saber and a berserker, a sword wielder who fights very aggressively and who often lets her anger fuel her actions. Now for the mythical Mordred, saber is very much a solid choice, notably making use of the sword Clarent which he stole from King Arthur. And while this digs into characterization a bit, Mordred was often depicted as being brutal and violent in comparison to the other Round Table knights, which is actually kinda scary. Many of them, particularly Lancelot, were no strangers to chopping people up. In any case, saber is a solid choice for Mordred. Getting into character design, we get to start with gender because Mordred has been flipped in the Fate franchise. Though don't let her hear you say that, she has a bit of a complex about it. Now, as for why Mordred was flipped, the obvious answer is because King Arthur was gender flipped too, and so it makes sense for Mordred, effectively a clone of Arthur and Fate's lore, to also be flipped. But that isn't the whole story. Apparently Mordred originally was going to be a man with an ambiguous gender identity, but Fate Apocrypha already had Astolfo. The creators thought that having two characters like that making their debut in the same series would be a bit much, and so Mordred was made female, though being very much a tomboy with her own identity issues. So gender swapped because of uncertainty about how fans would accept two ambiguous characters in the same series? I have questions about that, but let's just set that aside. For my part, I prefer my own answer that Mordred was flipped because Arthur was flipped already. But since we are on the subject, let's talk about Mordred's complex relationship with gender. On the one hand, Mordred hates being thought of as a woman, to the point of putting a sword to her master's neck the first time he brings it up, and threatening to kill him if he did so again. The root of this issue seems to be that Mordred didn't exactly have any good female role models in her life, since her mother was Morgan. Now I did do a video on Morgan, but the servant Morgan is the one from the Lostbelt, rather than the proper history one who raised Mordred. By all accounts, Morgan was a terrible parent, treating her children like tools to use in her schemes to overthrow King Arthur. As a result, some of her children, thinking all women were like that, grew up with not the most positive image of them, as Agravain rather famously expressed in the Camelot Singularity. But Mordred is still a woman, and so doesn't like being treated as a man either. This will come up many more times, but Mordred often struggles with a sense of belonging, not really feeling at home anywhere until she finds people who are able to accept her as she is. In short, Mordred just wants to be seen as Mordred, and not as part of some larger community that she struggles to connect with. I, for one, find this very relatable. Looking into Mordred's design, we have Mordred in full armor, Mordred without the helmet, Mordred without the armor, and then lastly Mordred's costume from Apocrypha. When it comes to Mordred in armor, you have the appearance of a very intimidating-looking knight, which certainly suits the character. The Mordred of Arthurian legend is often described as brutal, prone to violence, and even a bit dishonorable, so having a suit of armor that plays to that reputation seems quite fitting. As for Mordred's more casual clothing, this more clearly suits Mordred as we know her in the Fate franchise, especially her outfit from Apocrypha, which was purchased for her by her master and so is quite modern. As for the color scheme, red is Mordred's dominant color here, but you can find other depictions of Mordred wearing red as well. Well, red and black, those two traditionally evil colors, whereas Artoria's dominant color in contrast is blue. Lastly, Mordred does have a clear resemblance to her father Arthur, or rather Artoria. Though, since we now know that in appearance Morgan is basically just Artoria, but older and with a colder color scheme, Mordred looks noticeably distinct from both of her parents. I do approve of this, since we have enough saber faces already. As a whole, I'd say that Mordred has a solid design, giving clear hints about her personality and being distinct enough from her parents to be easily identifiable. Despite, the fact that Mordred is actually meant to be a clone, and so this is one of two cases where a saber face looking exactly like Artoria actually would make a lot of sense. Moving into her skill set, Mordred's first skill is Mana Burst, which increases her Buster card effectiveness for a turn. Mana Burst is a generic skill with many different types, with this generic one being specific to Artoria herself and Mordred. It is to tap into the huge amounts of magical energy within, wielding it as a burst of power in combat. Later on, we will get a skill upgrade that is tentatively being called Knight of Crimson Thunder, which will redress the balance and make Mordred one of the most competitive sabers in the game once more. But as for lore, since this skill is all about wielding a burst of magical power, it's pretty obvious that this is something made for Fate, having no basis in Arthurian legend. Really, the Mana Burst skill seems to me like a way to give both Artoria and Mordred something to represent their massive power in combat, but without giving them the hulking physique to match. That's just my take on things. Mordred's second skill is Intuition, which becomes Cigarette Lion after an upgrade. Intuition is a generic skill that grants critical stars, while Cigarette Lion adds star absorption for buster cards for a turn, and increases Mordred's crit damage 3 times for 3 turns. Instinct is another generic skill that is about, well, one's instincts in combat, being able to act without thinking in order to stay alive. This seems particularly fitting for Mordred, since her fighting style is very rough and often seems improvisational. It certainly helps to make her a very dangerous opponent, since she is able to quickly adapt to changing circumstances. We see this multiple times in Apocrypha, notably against Jack and Chiron. Both of them effectively ambushed Mordred, and so started with an advantage, only to see the tables turned once Mordred got past the initial surprise. As for Cigarette Lion, the only idea I have here is that it is a connection to her master in Apocrypha, Shishiko Kairi, who basically chain-smoked his way through that series. Generic though it may be, this is a decent skill for Mordred to have. Lastly, Mordred's third skill is Secret of Pedigree, which charges her MP up to 30%, removes all debuffs, and increases her defense for a turn. Now normally this is actually one of Mordred's MPs, but we get it as a skill here. This is meant to represent Mordred's obscured identity, symbolized by her helmet. Without seeing her face, and so her clear resemblance to King Arthur, people can't be entirely sure who Mordred really is. Now while this uncertainty being based around Mordred's helmet is something specific to the Fate franchise, Mordred initially not knowing her true parentage is not. That is something that comes from Arthurian legend. Now, whether or not this should really be a special skill, I don't really think so. After all, a servant's true identity is often carefully guarded, at least outside of FGO, and so this isn't exactly special. Then again, since this skill is centered around her wearing her helmet, people would have a harder time figuring out who she was when wearing that. Considering how few characters in this franchise actually wear full helmets, and how those who do often have great success in keeping their identities hidden, one would think this would be more common. But if that happened, the artists wouldn't be able to show off the characters they designed, so priorities. Mordred's noble phantasm is Clarent Blood Arthur, whereupon Mordred channels a massive amount of magical energy, and then unleashes it upon her foes, dealing a huge amount of damage in a surge of red lightning. This MP does extra damage to all Arthur enemies and gives Mordred a bit of MP refund, with both of these effects dependent upon overcharge. While it does resemble Excalibur a bit in the sense of being a sword swing that lets loose a huge burst of energy, Clarent is notably weaker than Excalibur, which obviously makes sense. As I mentioned before, Clarent is the sword that Mordred stole from King Arthur's armory, and would make use of during the Battle of Camelot. As for the whole Blood Arthur bit, the wording is a little weird, but it clearly is meant to represent Mordred's simmering rage about her rejection by King Arthur, which she uses to fuel this attack. Naturally, this MP is best used against Arthur specifically, hence the bonus damage when you do, but can still be effective against others. Now aside from the obvious that the real Clarent didn't unleash energy beams, this is an excellent choice for Mordred's MP. Mordred's craft essence is Who Am I?, depicting Mordred in the first person looking upon her helmet while on a burning battlefield, presumably Camelot. This CE centers around a core aspect of Mordred's characterization, namely her identity struggles in trying to figure out what sort of person she really is. Mordred both admires King Arthur as their son, and yet also hates Arthur for being rejected. We also have Mordred's gender issues, which I've already discussed. And, as I've also already mentioned, Mordred struggles with a sense of belonging, having not really found a place she could comfortably call home. But when she puts on her helmet, which conceals her true identity as the heir of King Arthur, she becomes just another nameless face upon the battlefield. These internal questions are central to Mordred's character, admittedly more so in Fate than in the original myth, but it is still a very solid craft essence for her. Mordred's Valentines CE is Strawberry Thunder Crunch, featuring a candy bar. Now while Thunder has a connection to Mordred's Fate depiction because of how often lightning features in her attacks, that's basically it. It's a lazy gift that Mordred seems to have grabbed at the last minute, only suddenly remembering that it is Valentine's and that she should get something for it. While this is in character for her, that's really all there is to say about it. And now for characterization, starting with Mordred's part in Arthurian legend. Now, as I covered before in my video on Morgan, Mordred is the son of King Arthur and his half-sister Morgause, though Arthur at least was unaware of this connection. This relationship didn't always exist, though. In the earliest iterations of Arthurian legend, Mordred is only noted as being something who fell at the Battle of Camelot alongside King Arthur, with no other specifics given. We don't even know if they were enemies, only that they both died in the battle. Over time, Mordred evolved into being King Arthur's final nemesis. First his nephew, the legitimate son of King Lot and Arthur's half-sister Morgause, and then later becoming King Arthur's bastard son, which has become the norm ever since. This actually makes Mordred the half-brother of other notable figures such as Gawain, Agravain, Gaheris, and Gareth, a connection that isn't really emphasized in Fate. I've always found it curious why that is the case. The only clear sibling connection emphasized seems to be between Gawain and Gareth. Anyway, moving on. Like with many characters who are part of Arthurian legend, Mordred has gone through significant amounts of evolution over time. In Mordred's case, it has been shifting from a purely evil figure, the treacherous knight who betrayed King Arthur, to one with more complexity and even some justification. Early on, Merlin tells Arthur a prophecy that a child born upon a given day, May 1st, or May Day, would grow up to be his ruin. King Arthur then had all the children born upon that day gathered up and put onto a ship, only for that ship to sink in rough seas, leading to all but one of the infants dying in what came to be called the May Day Massacre. Whether this sinking was deliberate on Arthur's part is not said, but if it was, it certainly clashes with the popular image of King Arthur as a noble and chivalrous king. As for me, I'm going to blame Merlin, because he's an easy target with a history of questionable morality. But, as I said, one infant did survive, and that one turned out to be Mordred, who was found by a fisherman and his wife, being raised by them for many years before reuniting with his real family. For much of the story between his conception and the final act, Mordred is a character in the background. He is there, but tends to remain a side character while others like Lancelot, Tristan, or Galahad take the spotlight. But when Mordred learns about his past, his true parentage, the May Day Massacre, and the prophecy that he would be the ruin of King Arthur, it broke him. In some versions, Mordred tries to escape that fate or even get himself killed, but eventually accepts it. In the final chapters of the story, Mordred takes center stage. He works with Agravain to try to expose Lancelot's affair with Guinevere, leading to Agravain's death, Lancelot's rampage, where Mordred himself is actually wounded, and Arthur sailing to France to attack Lancelot, leaving Mordred as regent in his absence. You may wonder why Arthur would leave Mordred as the one in charge while he was away. The simple answer is that of all the Round Table knights, Mordred was the only one who had any talent for administration. All of the others were great warriors, but not much use for governing. But while Arthur was away going after Lancelot, Mordred seized control of the country, and actually got a surprising amount of support for it too. You would think that a king as perfect as King Arthur would be unlikely to face a serious revolt, but flaws over the course of his reign had been made apparent, that the kingdom was not what it was presented as. How could the kingdom claim to be chivalrous when its knights killed each other in feuds? How could it claim to be honest when its best knight was engaged in an affair with the queen? How was it pious if, during the quest for the Grail, most of the knights failed by default due to their misdeeds, leaving only 3 truly capable of pursuing it? And lastly, was it truly an ideal kingdom if it was constantly engaged in strife and conflict? Some saw Mordred as a chance to start something new, perhaps something more honest rather than chasing a seemingly impossible ideal. And so Mordred was able to raise a sizable army to await King Arthur's return to Britain, meeting them at the Battle of Camelot. The casualties in this battle were apocalyptic, with Mordred slaying many Round Table knights, including Gawain, who had been badly wounded by Lancelot in earlier battles. By the end, only 4 were left standing: Arthur, Mordred, Bedivere, and Bedivere's half-brother Lucan. Arthur and Mordred faced off, with Arthur running Mordred through with the lance Rhongomyniad, only for Mordred to drag himself forward upon the lance and give Arthur a severe head wound. With Lucan expiring of his own wounds, Bedivere was the only one left to attend to the mortally wounded king, but that is a story for another video. Now with Mordred's story covered, how does it compare with her depiction in the Fate franchise? Well, it looks quite similar to Mordred's classical depiction, but with a few changes and added depth to the character. For starters, Mordred has been changed from a normal human to an artificial one created by Morgan. While this does add further complexity to Mordred's character, and it is what enables Mordred's odd friendship with Fran, it also seems like an effort to avoid a retcon. Fate's version of Arthurian legend crunches down time quite a bit, reducing the reign of King Arthur to 10 years. While the exact length of Arthur's reign is unclear, it was at least double that, with Lancelot's affair with Guinevere said to have lasted 24 years during the quest for the Holy Grail. Because of this significantly reduced timescale, Mordred doesn't have the chance to grow up the normal way. Neither does Galahad, for that matter. How did that work? I seem to have forgotten about that when I did the Galahad video. Oops. Anyway, so Mordred in Fate is now a homunculus, a clone created to match King Arthur, but raised by Morgan with the specific intention of being a tool to overthrow the king, rather than it being a prophecy about Mordred eventually doing so. But much like the Mordred of myth, Fate's Mordred spends a good amount of time trying not to be what destiny has in store for her. She looks up to Arthur as the ideal king, someone that she is happy to serve and fight for. Much like in myth, Mordred is brutal, coarse, and not exactly a shining example of chivalry, but there is little doubt that she is a very capable and loyal knight. But then, like in myth, Mordred finds out about her true origins, and everything falls apart. Mordred rushes to see King Arthur, ecstatic about having found out about their relation, only for the king to bluntly refuse Mordred's request for recognition. Now, a meeting like this is not found anywhere in Arthurian legend, but it isn't too hard to believe that it could have happened. Even so, Mordred's clear distress and anger at the king at the end of the meeting makes one wonder. Why did King Arthur just let Mordred be, after having threatened to ruin the kingdom? Why did Arthur presumably leave Mordred in charge while having to go deal with Lancelot later on? Either the king was a fool, or truly was disconnected from normal human emotions, an accusation leveled against King Arthur on several occasions. From there, things happen like they did in legend. Lancelot is caught in the affair, goes on a rampage, Mordred revolts, and we get the final battle where Mordred and Arthur kill each other. Moving past the backstory, our first encounter with Mordred is in Fate Apocrypha, where she acts as the Saber of Red. Mordred gets Shishigo Kairi as her master, which ends up being a very good match. Both of them are outcasts, more than a little unconventional, and have past demons that they struggle with. In Kairi's case, a dead daughter, while Mordred's is her very complicated relationship with her father. The two end up filling those voids in each other, and it makes for, in my opinion, the most compelling relationship in Apocrypha. It's certainly better than other ones in that series. Alas, Mordred and Kairi don't make it to the end, engaging in a bitter duel with Semiramis, someone who explicitly reminds Mordred of her mother, that leaves Kairi fatally wounded. Though neither of them ended up officially getting their wish for the Grail, in a way, their relationship gave them both what they were truly seeking. It is no accident that, once they left the series, I kinda stopped caring about Apocrypha. Mordred and Kairi were its two best characters. I mean, there still was Astolfo, but one character can't hold up an entire show. Anyway, it is in Apocrypha that we get the gist of Mordred's personality, and so can compare it to her mythological counterpart. Like her legend, Mordred is brutal, prone to violence, and fights in a way that, while pragmatic, might get some disapproval from honorable knights. But she does have her own sense of honor, is strictly against harming civilians, and proves to be a loyal ally to her master, in contrast to what you would expect from one called the Knight of Treachery. Notably, Mordred's wish upon the Grail isn't to become king, but to be given the same test that King Arthur once did, in order to prove her own worth to be a king. In other words, Mordred doesn't just want to take power, but wants to earn it. This does conflict with past depictions where Mordred is made more villainous, but does go well with more modern depictions where Mordred is given a more complex personality. As a whole, I'd consider Mordred's character to be an evolution of her depiction in Arthurian legend, taking the original as a base to give us a new take on the character. When it comes to her appearances in Fate Grand Order, our first meeting with Mordred is in the London Singularity, where she is the main ally to Mash and the protagonist. In comparison to Apocrypha, Mordred has mellowed out a fair bit, being much less angry about her life than before. Though it is said that servants tend not to take memories of previous incarnations with them, the experience of Apocrypha clearly has had a positive effect upon Mordred. She is still rough, quick-tempered, and all too ready to engage in violence, but her bitterness has been toned down. As an Apocrypha, Mordred proves to be a reliable, albeit a prickly ally, helping Chaldea to solve the London Singularity. In contrast, her next appearance is in Camelot, where she is acting as an enemy, one of the knights that chose to side with the Lion King. Like the other Round Table knights who made that decision, Mordred has her own personal reasons for doing so, namely that Mordred sees it as penance for her rebellion, leaning into the part of her that still admired the king despite being rejected. Faced with the prospect that the world is doomed, Mordred sees that, at the very least, she can help to preserve those who are deemed good by the king, despite knowing full well that Mordred is not among them. Indeed, the Lion King doesn't treat Mordred very well, but she seems to accept this, choosing to fight for the king with her usual zeal. It certainly is a different take on Mordred than what we saw earlier, foregoing her usual rebellious attitude. Nevertheless, it is interesting to see Mordred, faced with the impending doom of humanity, decide to choose to work towards a greater goal rather than her own personal grudges. In an odd way, it actually hints that Mordred really does care about the populace, and so has that going for her as a potential leader. She isn't just a power-mad tyrant, but has qualities that others would want to have in a ruler, and so giving us a hint as to why so many decided to follow Mordred in her rebellion against King Arthur. There are many more stories that Mordred makes an appearance in, but I think my head might explode if I went through every last one of them. Her interludes are notable for showing how she has given more thought to her earlier wish to be King Arthur's successor, now resolving that she wants to do it to make a better kingdom than her father rather than to just prove her own worth. Mordred does also appear in Lostbelt 3, though to be perfectly honest, it's hardly worth mentioning. Mordred is summoned there by Chaldea because she is one of 3 servants who are good at rebellion, but she gets far fewer character moments than the other 2. To be fair, she doesn't really need it, whereas Spartacus and Jinke certainly did. Other than that, Mordred appears in events whenever the story calls for a rough rebellious type who is nevertheless good at getting things done. More recently, she made a very brief appearance in the 2023 Christmas event, where she buddies up with Canis, a character quite similar to Mordred in temperament. But really, Mordred's main character development already has happened, and so delving into her many event appearances doesn't really feel necessary. Overall, my conclusion from earlier stands, that Mordred is a character that takes the existing legends about the character and grows upon that foundation, giving us something new in the process. And now for the verdict. What grade would I give Mordred's depiction in Fate Grand Order in the wider Fate franchise? Well, it's decent. Her character design and skill set do show clear links to the original legend, though creative license has been taken in a number of areas. As for characterization, Mordred does connect to the original myth, being the son of King Arthur who ultimately led to his downfall. But the Mordred we get in the Fate franchise goes beyond that, giving us a new take on the character that has complicated relationships, and still manages to let her own good qualities shine through despite her coarse personality. I like Fate's take on Mordred more than the original. It makes for a more interesting character. Mordred in Legend has gone from a 2-dimensional villain for King Arthur to one with more complex and understandable motivations, and the Mordred we get in Fate seems to be a further evolution of that trend. And so for a final grade, I'm going to give Mordred, the Knight of Treachery, a B-. I've always liked Mordred's depiction in Fate. Her and Kyrie were what I enjoyed most about Apocrypha. She's one of those characters that, when she makes an appearance during an event, I can at least be assured that part of it will make me smile or laugh. And if you would like to learn more about the one who raised Mordred to overthrow King Arthur, or rather her Lostbelt version, check out my video on Morgan here. Until next time.